Hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to talk about MDX scripting functions. Those are four. So first one is the calculate, freeze, scope, and if functions. These are the four scripting functions. On the right side, if you observe, the first function is the calculate. The calculate is by default, it will generate the Visual Studio whenever we're trying to, start creating the new calculated members. Normally, if you will have two views, right? Form view and script view. Generally, in the form view, you can see the calculate is in the function is defined in the starting, because without calculate function, you cannot create any calculated measures in the cube. So basically, calculate function will help you to create a calculated members, which will be aggregated based on your granularity selection. That is the functionality of the calculate. You can see the same definition given here. The calculate command controls the aggregation of leaf cells in the cube. If the calculate command is deleted or modified, the data within the cube is affected. You should edit this command only if you manually specify how the cube is aggregated. So that's the default behavior of the calculate function. So it will aggregate the data at selected granularity. So we don't add these manually. So by default, it will come with your calculation part. That's about the calculate function. Now moving on to the freeze. I mean, we're supposed to talk about freeze, but before we talk about freeze, let's talk about the scope function. Okay, scope function is actually limits the scope of specified MDX statement within the subcube. So basically, the scope function will help you to change the behavior during the runtime of your execution. I mean, browsing the cube or executing the MDX queries. So basically, this scope will create the another subcube on top of the whatever the cube that we have, right? So on top of it, it will create the subcube. Let's see some examples how the scope function works in the MDX world. Okay. Now here, so I go to the script view on my calculation. Now start writing the scope function. So we'll start with small thing, okay, and then what we can do. So first we'll write the scope. So this is the starting point of the scope. Now what I want to do here, so I want to change my sales NDP USD value to hard coded value. Okay, now this is my sales NDP USD, and now what I want to do. So normally, if you go back and browse the sales NDP USD in here, this is connected to the my existed cube, which is the retail cube, and here you can see sales NDP say ASP USD, and let me drag the NDP USD also. Show fields list, and then let me remove this and drag the NDP USD. Now you can see we have the good amount of NDP USD in our cube. Now what I want to do for the sales NDP USD, I want to update the default value, which is something 20. That will be my default value, and after that I'll end the scope function. So this is how we write. Now what we are trying to tell the scope function. Okay, so I have the NDP USD measure. For that measure, please update the value equals to 20 and then end the scope. It's like a case statement in normal SQL. Now what will happen, the backend architecture, right? So the main cube where we have a sales in NDP USD, we have a valid records where you can see the valid records on the left side, right? Now when the script executed to come to this level, what will happen if the scope is parsed, it will create one more subcube for sales in NDP USD, and then it will display the value, hard-coded value to 20. So since it's mentioned in the last, so always the scope function will execute in the last part of your calculated members. Okay, and that too we need to keep our scope function always in the last of our calculated members, because based on your previous actions, there can be a lot of actions can happen on the sales NDP USD level, right? But in the end, you like to see your hard-coded value for sales in NDP USD. That will be your last action, right? So that's the reason the scope function we define and we put it in the last in our calculated members under the calculation tab. The scope function will allow you to play with your measures and dimensions on the certain conditions and certain criteria. Now here we simply updating the sales NDP USD equals to 20. Now let me deploy this calculated scope, and then we'll refresh in the Excel. Okay, now my change is deployed, my scope function is deployed. Now I go to Excel file and refresh all. So now you can see my NDP USD value is changed to hard coded. So whatever we have in the values in the main cube, right? So which is under POC. So because of the scope function, there is a subcube got created, and within the subcube, the NDP USD value is got overridden, right? So that's the scope function. I mean, this is the one example. Let me get some more example. So now here what I want to, I just wrote some script on my notepad. Let me copy them. So this is my second scope function. Here what I'm doing, I'm just using the nested scope. Within the scope, I'm using one more scope again. Now what I'm trying to do, so I have one calculated measure. So this calculated measure I need to create first in the starting. Okay, let me create the calculated measure. So I created calculated measure scope test. Now the scope test, I assign the null value, right? So by default, it's assigned to the null value, but the scope test measure should be override. Whatever the null value that we defined, right, should be override when we select the seller geo country, that dimension when the user is selected. So I want to populate my sales in net USD multiplied with the 10% and assign to the scope test measure. Okay, that is my expectation. Now that's what same thing I wrote here. So first I choose the scope. What is the condition that I need to enable at scope test measure, and what is the second condition? When the user selects seller geo country, change the behavior of scope test measure to and populate the sales in net USD multiplied with 10. Now let's see what will happen. So now I deploy this calculation script, I mean the changes. Now let me refresh my Excel file. So yeah, once you deploy the cube, you need to refresh the Excel file, then only you can see the changes. Now what I'll do, I will go to here, show field list. Let me remove the NDPUSD, and here where are my calculated measures? Scope test is the measure that we created. Now you can see here, since I selected the seller geo country, right? So as a part of my rows, you can see seller geo country is part of my rows. Now what I'll do, I'll simply remove the seller geo and drag the buyer region. Now you see the scope test is showing the blank value, but again, if I drag back the seller geo country, where is the seller geo country? Then it will show the value. It will be populated with sell in net USD. That's the behavior I'm writing here. Even not only the behavior, you can also format the measure value. Now here, what I'm trying to do, so whatever the scope test, right, that the format string will be 0. This is what I want to display that measure value. Now you can see here it's showing the 2 decimal value, right, the scope test value. After the dollar value, revenue value, it's showing the 2 decimal values. Now let me deploy this change. I want to control the format string. So what I'll do, I'll refresh the Excel file. That's it. You can see the format string is now it's rounded to a standard value without any decimal value. So I mean, it's not like the scope function you need to use only to control the calculation. Instead of the controlling calculation, sometimes you can change your format string dynamically based on your user selection. That is the another example. Now moving on. So even the scope function you can write on different hierarchy levels. Now let me drag some of the hierarchy levels. So here I wrote three. I mean, I'm using the time hierarchy because I created hierarchy in my time dimension. So here I have three levels. One is the level one is my year, level two is half year, level three is the quarter. So now when the user is at level three, which is the quarter, I want to nullify my sales in net USD. Okay, and the user is at levels 2, which is my half year. I want to populate my sales in net USD default value to 100, and then if the user at level 1, which is my year level, I want to display the string value under the sales in net USD. This is my requirement. Now let me, I wrote my scope statement with all the hierarchy levels and conditions, and then here again, so every time you write the scope function, it will create the subcube based on your selection. Now here what will happen, now let me refresh the Excel file. Now you can see here the scope test is actually scope test is failed because the sales in net USD we are overwriting. So now for now, remove the scope test column from the picture because we are overwriting the value of the sales in net USD. Now let me remove it. Okay. Now, so you see here, now we are at the year level. That is my level one, levels one from the time hierarchy, right? Now we are in the year level. That's the reason it's showing the year level. Now, if I expand to the semester, half year level, so we hard coded the sales in net USD value to 1000. That's what we see here. Now, if I expand further, then it will show the null value. Okay, so since it's there are no values, it's not expanding. Let me drag the one more additional measure to see what we see under the quarter level. That will be our level 3, right? So yeah, now you can see here the sales in net USD is showing the null value because that's what we defined here. When level 3 is quarter, then the sales net USD is nullified, right? So that's how the scope function works. And even you can write some additional conditions like if statement. That's the one that we're supposed to talk in the next, because the if statement is also part of our scripting function. So what it does, it executes the statement. It will check whether it's a condition is true or false. So you can use the if condition within the scope function. What I'm trying to do here, so if the current measure, whatever the measure that user selected is sales in net USD, then hard code the value to 1000 and then end if. And similarly, I wrote the same if statement here in the second. That's how the if statement works. So basically, why I use this POC cube, because it's very lightweight, and it was designed uh, me. And if you want to build the same POC cube on your local, so I would suggest to go to my other videos under the SSAS MOLAP playlist. There I clearly explained how to create the dimension facts and dimensions, and use those facts and dimensions how you can create the retail cube. So all those details I shared in that video. So I will provide that into my description. I'll provide the link under my description. You can go through and have a look at it to create this retail cube. Right, so that's about scope and if and calculate function. So basically, scope will create the subcube all the time. So whatever the user first select, right? So let's say if the user is browsing some data here, so until it comes to this particular action, it's called main cube that he is browsing. Once the scope condition satisfies, the cube will create the subcube by using the scope function and then achieve our conditions. That's how the scope function works. Now moving on to freeze function. So freeze function is actually locks the values of specified subcube and to their current values. So generally what will happen if you have a dependency with multiple measures, and if you change the one measure in between and you don't want to change the other measure value, then freeze function, we can use it and we can freeze the value and lock the value, cell value all the time. Now let's get into the examples. Let me remove these. Don't worry, I will post the scope function in my comment sessions, so you can copy and use it in your local. Okay, now for the freeze, I have created just a couple of examples. Let me explain. And here, so here I created what I did. I created the two measures. One is the freeze test A, where I assigned the value to 5. Default hard-coded value is 5. And similarly freeze test B. And for freeze test B, I used the freeze test A value. That's how I mapped it. Now what will happen? So I freeze the freeze test B. Okay. So now, and what I did in the runtime, again I changed the freeze test A value to 10. Okay, so now what will happen? Let me comment this and then deploy, because I don't want to freeze. Now let's see. Let me show you how the value changes in the runtime using the scope. Now let me go to my Excel file. Oh, I accidentally clicked the drill down action. Let me delete it. So here, let me refresh all, and then here what I do, I'll remove all these columns and I'll drag the freeze test A, freeze test B. Now the freeze test A and freeze test B should display the same values. Now you can see here both values are showing the same, because freeze test A is 5, right? That is the value that I assigned on the right side. You can see in my Visual Studio. And then freeze test B, I just mapped the freeze test A value to freeze test B, and then in the runtime I change my freeze test A value to 10. That's the reason the same 10 value is updated to freeze test B. But my requirement is whenever I update the freeze test A value, I don't want to change my freeze test B. Right, so that scenario, the freeze function will be very helpful. Now I just after I assign the value to freeze test B, I just freeze the value using the freeze function, and then use the scope function to update the freeze test A. Now if I deploy this change, now let's see what will happen. Come on, why it's taking time to deploy? It seems, yeah, it's got deployed the change. Now if I go here and refresh all, and you can see, bingo. So your freeze test B value is not changing because it's locked, even though your freeze test A value is changed in the scope. Right? So that's how the freeze test function works. And this is about 4 MDX scripting functions, and these are the very handy when you're in the when you want to change something in the runtime. So these functions are very helpful. Calculate especially. So without the calculate, you cannot write calculated members. Of course you can write, but you need to define your own aggregations. Otherwise the calculate function will take care of the aggregation of your each calculated measure. So that's about MDX scripting functions.